Thank you everyone for joining us. We are very glad to go on with our monthly program in the frame of this seminar, Predatory State and Conflict and Resistance. We are today in an English version of the seminar. We are very happy and excited to have a presentation by Dr. Frances Thomson from SOAS in London. Frances will present her work and talk about the topic, the very important topic of the political economy of land dispossession. We will let Frances Thomson have the floor for about 45 minutes. And then Dr. Mehrdad Vahabi will open the discussion with around 15 minutes discussion, to which Frances will have time to answer shortly, around 5 minutes maybe, and then we will open the discussion with the floor. I will try to moderate the seminar and keep track of the time. And I remind once again that the seminar is recorded. Yeah, so with no further introduction. Oh, actually, I didn't introduce myself, sorry. So I'm Emma Thirou. I am a PhD student in Paris 13, or Sorbonne, Paris North, at CEPN. I'm currently working on actually a very similar topic that Frances, so I'm really glad that you agreed to join us. Thank you again. I'm working on land dispossession and the state in Brazil. So maybe Mehrdad Vahabi wants to have a quick introduction word, and then we can leave the floor to Frances.
Just a few words to extend your welcoming to Dr. Thomson. Just to say that all the organizers of this seminar, they're all very glad, pleased to know that you have accepted our invitation and present your work on the political economy of land dispossession. We think that this contributes largely to a kind of exchange on the nature of the state, the way it interferes in a political economy, and can be an interesting research program on which we may have many cooperation in the future, knowing that Emma and some other PhD doctors, they are trying also to work on the same issue. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Frances, if you will, the floor is yours for about 45-50 minutes.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I wanted to start by thanking you to the organizing committee for inviting me, and to Professor Vahabi for acting as discussant, and especially to Emma for getting in touch and also helping me with the slides today so that I can actually see my notes. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to be here. Emma told me a bit about the origins of your seminar and its aims, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to share my research with your group. I hope you'll agree that the phenomena I touch on in my presentation has really interesting implications for how we think about the state, how we think about property rights, and how we think about the role of the state and property rights in capitalist market economies. Next slide, please, Emma. Next slide. Oh, yeah, sorry. That's fine, back one. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's it. So originally I had planned to organize my presentation today around broad claims about land dispossession, with the aim of showing why conventional counts are inadequate. But I felt the presentation needed more empirical material. I didn't think it worked without more empirical materials. So what I've done instead is left these claims as possible points for discussion. Of course, you can decide, if these are claims we should discuss. But I still thought it would be useful to introduce some of them at the beginning, so that you might think about these claims as I present. And I thought 4 claims are perhaps most relevant for what I'm going to speak about today. The first one, land dispossession, arises in the absence of a strong rule of law and clearly defined formal property rights. The second one, dispossession is antithetical to capitalist economies in which competitive markets based on clearly defined property rights ensure an efficient use and allocation of land. The third one, a high prevalence and/or risk of dispossession hinders economic growth. And finally, democratic states dispossess people of their land and homes only exceptionally for the public good. So these are all quite common claims. If you want to have a look at the literature, there's a bibliography in my thesis, and I can talk about, you know, who says these kinds of claims in what context. I think it's important to say that, you know, please don't assume that my aim is to assert the opposite of these claims. That's not my aim. So we know that it's true people without legal title to their land are more vulnerable to dispossession and are likely to receive lower compensation when they are dispossessed. But for example, in this case, we could qualify the claim and say a lack of formal property rights is an enabling condition for dispossession, but it's not necessary and it's not sufficient. Likewise, you know, to give another example, I'm not going to argue that a high prevalence or risk of dispossession is good for growth. I think we need more nuanced counterclaims. So most dispossession is supposedly aimed at generating growth and development, and whether it does so or not depends on multiple factors. I would also point out that it's possible, for example, to have sustained growth in contexts where there's widespread dispossession, and Colombia, I think, is a clear example of this. How can this happen, right? That might be another question. And I think part of the answer lies in the fact that the risk of dispossession doesn't affect everyone or all people and places equally, and that's really important. And I'm going to try and sort of show that in my discussion of Colombia and the United States. So there's a clear class dimension to the phenomenon of dispossession, and in some cases, an ethnic and racial one too. It comes to mind, for example, Naomi, anyone's read her book, but that might be a useful way to think about it. Another explanation of how it's possible to have widespread dispossession and growth together is that dispossession is disguised, right? So it's made to seem exceptional. So, you know, not everybody's necessarily aware of what's happening, and so there's not necessarily this perception of insecurity. Anyway, I don't want to go on too much longer about this, but I just wanted to sort of put forward these four common claims about land dispossession, so that maybe you could frame what I'm presenting, thinking about these claims, and thinking about how what I'm going to present destabilizes these claims. So this will give me a chance to spend a bit more time on the actual empirics. And the first bit of the presentation, I'm going to talk about Colombia, which is where I focused on Colombia for my PhD research. And in the second part of the presentation, I'm going to focus on my paper about expropriations in the United States, which was actually a spin-off from my PhD research. So yeah, on to the first part. Thank you. Actually, I don't need that one up either. Next one, please. So as I just mentioned, my doctoral research focused on the political economy of land and dispossession in Colombia. And I want to provide a bit of context before I launch into some of the specifics. As of 2016, Colombia was said to have the largest internally displaced population in the world. The official and immediate cause of this displacement calamity is the decades-long conflict. However, displacement has also been used as a tool of land appropriation. It was and is sometimes the purpose rather than an unintended consequence of violence. Specifically, paramilitaries and their elite allies orchestrated the displacement of countless households and communities to take over their land or employed violence to prevent the displaced from reclaiming their homes, farms, and territories. Collateral damage, I don't like that word, but it gets the idea across. Collateral damage type displacement, and that motivated by factors other than economic interest in the land, has also inadvertently served diverse diverse investment projects. And it's really important to note that it's not always possible to distinguish between these opportunistic acquisitions and cases when the land was the motivating factor behind the violence. And then finally, just given that people often show an interest in numbers, I want to emphasize that it's not possible to adequately quantify dispossession in Colombia at the moment. Some people say that half of the circa 7.4 million people registered as displaced persons had land, which they were forced to abandon due to the conflict. But these figures, they don't distinguish between people whose land was actually taken from them, stripped from them, those who perhaps sold willingly, but in a state of distress. So these are kind of like gray area sales where it's not completely voluntary, but it's not completely coerced either. And people, for example, whose abandoned lands are not claimed by others, who have gone back or could go back because no one's claiming their land. So this is not a good. People often use it as an indication, but land abandonment and land usurpation are clearly different. So it's not a very good figure, and I really don't have a good figure or a reliable figure to give you. Next slide, please. So given what I just said, it might come as a surprise that one of my research aims was to shift focus away from the armed conflict. This didn't mean ignoring the conflict. Of course, I had to talk about the armed conflict in my analysis. I couldn't ignore it. But so mainstream media and other sources often treat dispossession in Colombia as if it were an aberration of the war, you know, something there's war or there's armed conflict, this is why this is happening. And I felt this was a mistake. So I wanted to focus on the wider social, political, legal, economic and historical context. And actually my thesis goes all the way back to the Spanish invasion of what is now Colombia. So it has a lot of historical chapters. But anyway, the other thing is that I wanted to situate what's been happening in Colombia within the growing literature on dispossession and land grabbing rather than debates on civil war. And indeed, the more I read about land grabbing in other countries like India or Brazil, where Emma studies, places that are not at war, the more convinced I became of the need to move beyond explanations that overemphasize the armed conflict to the detriment of other factors. So I decided to include cases that ostensibly occurred outside the conflict setting, and to examine different types of land dispossession. Broadly speaking, state-backed dispossession and that imposed without official state sanction. Though actually, as we'll see, this division is actually not so neat. So anyway, next slide, please. It should be, oh yeah, that's right, sorry. So for the purposes of today, there's just so much to talk about, and I thought, okay, what am I going to focus on? So what I decided to focus on in thinking about the aims of your seminar and things is specifically state-backed dispossession. And I use the term state-backed dispossession in a really specific way. I mean land dispossession that's sanctioned by the state officially, right, in the name of the public. As you all probably know, most legal systems bestow the state with eminent domain or taking powers, which allows the state to take possessions or property. In this case, I'm interested in land or buildings, homes on top of the land as well, against the wishes of the land's holder or the landowner, and as I said, in the name of the public. Some texts refer to public necessity, which some refer to public purpose or interest, some refer to public benefit. I think I would see this as relevant because actually necessity and interest are quite different things, but anyway, it really doesn't seem to matter what word is used, and we can talk about that later. In the case of Colombia, the constitution refers to public utility and social interest. So full and direct expropriation is perhaps the most obvious form of state-backed dispossession, but there are other types. And in my research, I identified at least 7. The forcible acquisition of easements and use rights is another type, which, unlike full expropriation, does not involve a transfer of ownership. And obviously not all coerced transfers of use rights can reasonably be labeled dispossession. You know, having, I don't know, an internet company put a cable on your house, that's not just, you know, you can't really call that dispossession. But there are some types of infrastructure, like oil pipelines, for example, that can partially or completely inhibit farming activities on the land and thus lead to land loss in practice. There are also transfers forced under the threat of expropriation or legal action, which I'm going to return to in a few minutes, precisely because this is one of the most prominent or important forms of state-backed dispossession, at least in Colombia and also in the US. The imposition, so another type is the imposition of corporate investments in collectively owned ethnic territories, which is perhaps specific to Colombia. I'm not sure about this. That it would be interesting to know if this happens elsewhere. So basically, these collective titles, they're inalienable. So you can't impose a project of public utility and social interest through expropriation because they're inalienable. You can't sell the land, right? So what the Colombian government does is, you know, any company that wants to dig for minerals, for example, or drill for oil in these lands, by law they have to consult with the Afro community or the indigenous community, but the law's been interpreted in such a way that the consultation doesn't mean that consent is required. So after the process of prior consultation, then the government says we've you know, and the company says we've completed with our legal duties, and then it's approved, you know, even if the community opposes that project happening on their land. So it's quite ironic, but often the prior consultation process is kind of like a mechanism of dispossession. And then there's dispossession of people whose lands are officially considered state-owned, or baldios, which is different to like fiscal lands in the case of Colombia. But the basic point is that these people don't have a land title. And in Colombia, these lands, baldios, the state lands, they cannot be expropriated in the technical or legal sense of the term, because this land already belongs to the state. So the state can't expropriate it to, you know. So to the extent that any official procedure is involved, what this involves is a declaration of the area as reserved, and then sometimes a process called baldio recovery. More commonly though, baldio or state lands are acquired without a legal process through informal transfers. So often a company will just come in and offer a person payment just for their mejoras, or buildings and crops, improvements is the technical translation, but not the land itself. Precisely on the grounds that the person doesn't have a title. So the company's reps would say things like, you better take what I'm offering now, or you won't get anything because you don't even have a land title. So it's kind of a threat, you know, the state said I can be here, I'm going to dig for minerals, I'm going to drill for oil, I have, you know, I've got the backing of the state, so you may as well just take whatever I'm offering. You don't even have a land title. Yeah, so this method looks really similar to number 3. The difference is that the dispossessed don't technically own the land. So there's no formal transfer, like a title deed transfer, right? There's no formal property ownership transfer in this case. But for the sake of simplicity, I often group them together under this banner of transfers under threat. And finally, there is environmental dispossession due to the impacts of state-backed projects. And there's lots of examples in Colombia, for example, where oil extraction or coal mining have had such severe impacts that you know, farming or living in the land is no longer viable. And such cases don't fit exactly with my definition, but they're really important in certain areas, in certain industries. And they're really, well, interestingly, they're similar to what US property law scholars call indirect takings. And in the US legal system, actually, these cases can be deemed a functional equivalent to a taking and litigated as such. And they call them inverse takings because it's the person, rather than the government starting the procedure, it's the person who's affected who says, you basically took my land because it's ruined because of your mining project or your dam, so you should have to pay me now. Like, you know, you should have bought it in the first place, or, you know. Okay, wow. Next slide, please. So, in Colombia, eminent domain powers are used to back a variety of projects. Some examples here are urban redevelopment, roads, ports, hydroelectric dams is a big one, mining, and oil and gas. Interestingly, in Colombia, the Colombian government doesn't use eminent domain powers at the moment for agribusiness or commercial forestry. So there is dispossession for agribusiness. It exists in Colombia. There is dispossession for commercial forestry. It exists in Colombia. But this dispossession is different in the sense that it's not backed by the state's eminent domain powers. And today, I'm going to focus mostly on the mining and oil sectors. Next slide, please. So under the Colombian constitution, the state owns the subsoil and non-renewable natural resources in general. The state grants companies or individuals the right to explore and exploit the subsoil through concession contracts. And as you can see in these maps, active and offered concession blocks cover large areas of Colombia. This does not mean the entirety of this land is going to be exploited. I really want to emphasize this. I'm not saying all of this land is going to be dispossessed, you know, that it's going to be cleared of people for this purpose. You know, a lot of those areas will only be explored and nothing will happen. They won't drill for oil there, you know, etc. But I still wanted to show you the maps because I wanted to give you an idea of the geographical spread of the potential impacts. And these maps, by the way, they're generated in Google Maps, but the overlays are created by an NGO called Tierra Minada, and they take government data. So they take data from the National Hydrocarbons Agency and the National Mining Agency, and they put that spatial data together and make these overlays. They're called KMZ files, and then you just open them with Google Earth. And anyway, next slide, please. So the oil and mining sectors have become a really important source of foreign exchange earnings for Colombia, especially since the 1980s. As you can see in the graph, in both the graphs actually, you can see how export value increased since then, but you can also see how the relative weight of mining and oil became higher as, for example, coffee declined in terms of its relative importance for export values. In 2012, around the height of the most recent extractive boom, mining and hydrocarbons combined represented almost 3/4 of total annual export values in Colombia, and more than 80% of foreign direct investment in the country. Around the same time, the mining and energy sectors, so this is the sort of height of the most recent boom, right? I'm talking 2012, 13. The commodity prices went down after that, but especially oil, but especially things like gold and other types of minerals are likely to go up again. So I assume there will be another boom coming, maybe not for oil, but anyway, we'll see. The point is that around this time of the most recent boom, the mining and energy sectors accounted for 11.2% of total GDP and 30% of state income. However, these sectors, because they're capital rather than labor intensive, despite their weight in the economy in other senses, they each account for less than 1% of direct employment in the country. I also think it's worth emphasizing that Colombia became much more reliant on imports during this period as it shifted away from import substitution industrialization and towards a more export-oriented economic strategy. And it's really important to emphasize that this includes food imports, despite being able to produce almost everything and anything you can imagine, because there's so many, how do you call that, different, you know, there's mountains, there's lowlands, there's highlands. Colombia has been importing an increasing amount of food over the last 30, 40 years. And this, I believe, has exacerbated the government's drive to expand the extractive industries, because they need more and more foreign exchange earnings to keep the economy running, right? Though I should also say that this country's dependence on these sectors has been encouraged deliberately and reproduced by government policy. And successive governments have openly said, you know, we want Colombia to be a mining power. In any case, the relevant point here is that this dependence on mining and oil for foreign exchange earnings and for state income as well has distorted the Colombian government's land use laws and policies. Well, distorted in my opinion, that's how I see it. And these policies just permit coercion to be used to ensure that these sectors can operate unencumbered. Next slide, please. So Colombian law, and this is important, it declares all facets of the hydrocarbon and mining industries as projects of public utility and social interest. All facets. This is a blanket declaration. It applies regardless of where the located. It applies regardless of how many people have to be uprooted to make way for that mine or that oil field. It applies regardless of what impact that mine or that oil field might have on other economic sectors like fishing or agriculture or tourism. It's basically a dispossession free pass with no consideration, in this case, of the particularities of each project. What are the actual public utility and social interests served here? Does it really serve public costs and benefits? So it means that Colombian people have no enforceable legal right to refuse oil or mining operations on their land. And there's an interesting contrast with the legislator's views with local citizens' views, illustrated in this case with popular consultations. So these popular consultations, they offered a route for people to challenge the extractive development model collectively at the municipal level. The municipality of Pierres in Tolima was the first to hold this kind of consultation in 2013. And they basically asked the question, do you agree with having mining activities in the municipality? 2,971 said no, 24 said yes. And basically Pierres was being targeted by Anglo Gold Ashanti's mining project La Colosa, which would have been one of the largest gold extraction operations in Colombia and perhaps in South America. And I say would have been because in 2017, the multinational said that it would suspend the project because another popular consultation took place in Cajamarca, the municipality that was going to be at the center of the mine's operations. In addition to Pierres and Cajamarca, there are 7 other municipalities that held popular consultations, and in all the cases, an overwhelming majority of inhabitants voted against allowing oil or mining operations within their territories, within their municipalities. And that's what's illustrated in this infograph on the right, which was created by the newspaper La República. And as of June 2017, another 44 municipalities were in the process of trying to organize similar consultations. But the central government was not happy about this at all and found many, many ways to stop these consultations from going ahead. So this became this big sort of media battle and political and legal battle. And basically the extractive industry firms, their representatives and their allies in governments, they said the municipal authorities have absolutely no power to decide whether there will be mining or oil operations within a municipality. In 2016, the Constitutional Court, it was a close decision, 5-4, said, actually, yes, mayors and local councils can prevent mining investments because they have a say over the use of the soil. And in order to get to the subsoil, which belongs to the state, you have to go through the soil, right? So they said, yeah, their regulations could impact whether there is mining or not in a municipality. And the battles went on. And then in 2018, the Constitutional Court contradicted the 2016 decision and ultimately said, no, you cannot prevent a mining or oil investment from going ahead through municipal popular consultation. So the Constitutional Court backtracked, or I guess contradicted another sala, I don't know how you said, another decision, and took away the only legal route that people had to prevent mining and oil exploitation in their lands. Next slide, please. So in the course of my research, I came to the conclusion that these sectors are absolutely dependent on state coercion. The oil and mining industries don't just profit from dispossession, they rely on it. And they're not the only sectors. Nevertheless, the role of state coercion in mobilizing land for capital accumulation, it's not always immediately obvious. And here it's worth returning, not actually to the slide, but remembering what I said earlier about the many different forms of state-backed dispossession. And what I found through my research is that eminent domain powers are rarely exercised directly in Colombia. Expropriation and legal proceedings are the exception rather than the rule. And partially, or one big reason, but not the only reason for this, is that under Colombian law, companies are expected to attempt negotiations with landowners privately before asking for state intervention. So they can't just go right to the National Mining Agency or right to the Ministry of Mines and say, we want this land expropriated. They have to try first to acquire the land without these legal processes or administrative processes. So most land acquisitions for mining, oil, and other big infrastructure projects like ports or roads and dams are achieved through private transfers. But this does not mean that these are voluntary transactions. And that's a really interesting thing. Legally, they look like voluntary transactions on paper. But actually, often these purchases are below market prices, and even payment may be so low that the dispossessed actually cannot even afford to purchase new land elsewhere. And I just want to give you a few examples to really illustrate this point. So researchers, NGOs, and journalists have all documented this happening for lands occupied by the Cerrejón coal mine, which is the largest coal mine in Colombia and actually one of the largest in the world. Inhabitants of Albania, for example, a rural sub-district near the coal mine, told journalists that they'd been forced to sell for between 15,000 and 25,000 pesos per hectare. And that's between $5 and $50 per hectare. The reason it's such a big range is because the journalists don't tell you what year the land was bought, and obviously the exchange rate from pesos to dollars changes a lot over the years. So, but it's a very low amount, and a lot of them said they just couldn't afford to get replacement land. In other cases, firms actually decide compensation amounts in advance. Remember, they even use the word compensation, even though these are supposed to be private sales, right? But they use the word compensation. And this system, it can prevent ludicrous underpayment, but it also shows that land prices are non-negotiable. So it's clearly not a normal voluntary market transaction if you can't negotiate. If you as the seller are not allowed to negotiate, this is the compensation, that's it, right? You have to sell. This is a project of public utility and social interest. You don't have a choice, okay? Sometimes in these cases, the amount offered to landowners is based on values in the cadastre. And in Colombia, cadastres are not very well updated, and in some places, the value in a cadastre can be up to 15 times lower than commercial prices. So again, in these cases, what people are paid for their land is often insufficient for them to get replacement land. I don't want to imply that all property transfers linked to state-backed investments are coerced. Not always, right? But those who sell willingly usually have the power, the knowledge, and the resources to negotiate a good price. And also they're people who typically have little attachment to their land and mainly see it as a financial or economic asset, right? So some people are compensated well, but the vast majority who get moved anyway tend to be, you know, peasant farmers, campesinos, as they say in Colombia, or people in poor neighborhoods in the case of urban dispossession. So underpayment, this phenomenon that I've just been talking about, underpayment is markedly a class phenomenon. And as I said before, the people who are absolutely worst off are those who do not have formal property rights. In this case, the firm won't even pay them for the land in some cases, but just for the crops or the building, you know, the constructions, their house. Next slide, please. Actually, let's skip this because I'm going quite over. So yeah, next slide, please. So the, yeah, sorry, the one before, armed conflict in zones. Yeah. So I'm coming to the end of this first part of, you know, this bit of the presentation, and I want to return to where I started, to the role of armed conflict in land dispossession. So across Colombia, mass displacements have occurred just before and or amidst the imposition of state-backed projects. And there is evidence indicating that in some cases, so-called conflict-induced displacement may have in fact been a deliberate strategy of land clearance for these projects, although it's usually very difficult to prove. So regardless though of whether violent displacement was intended to do so, it certainly has facilitated corporate land occupations. And in addition to forced displacement, the conflict context more generally has facilitated land sales. It's weakened communities during negotiations surrounding compensation or negotiations surrounding resettlement, and it's undermined resistance. Critics and opponents of mining, oil, dams, the big port projects, they're regularly silenced. And actually in Colombia, it's kind of, you have to ask the question the other way around. It's really surprising to find examples of mining or oil or infrastructural investments that are not tainted by assassinations, death threats, and other forms of intimidation. I should clarify that Colombia's guerrilla groups are notorious for attacks on oil and mining operations and these industries' employees, and this posed serious difficulties in some areas. The exact opposite could be said of paramilitary groups, which historically at least worked alongside the army to defend national and international investors against the armed insurgency, as well as against unarmed social movements. In this sense, counterinsurgency warfare is closely intertwined with investment interests. And the quote on the right-hand side of the slide illustrates the point well. I'm going to give you a second to read it because I need to catch my breath and have a sip of water anyway.
And I'm just precising that if you can maybe finish in 20 minutes, if that's okay.
Yeah, I've got my timer going, so I'm keeping an eye on things. Okay, so the other thing that's really complicated is there's been close cooperation between extractive industry firms and government armed forces. So for the last sort of 20, 30 years, oil and mining companies have been signing what's called collaboration agreements with the Colombian army, in which the former contribute resources in money or in kind in exchange for special protection. Company facilities often double up as military bases, and their private security firms often work with local army units. And this special relationship is particularly problematic given the long history of human rights abuses committed by the Colombian army and their close collaboration with, and in some cases, direct participation in paramilitary groups. And some companies also maintained a more direct relationship with the paramilitaries. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is an example, but I'm actually going to skip it just because of time. It's an example of paramilitary violence linked with coal. Next slide, please. Yeah. So this is my last slide in this section, and what I want to do is kind of try and bring together what I just said into some clear conclusions, I hope. 6 to be precise. The first point is about how specific visions and trajectories of economic development shape the scope, scale, and character of land dispossession. In this case, there's a fraction of the Colombian elite that insists that Colombia cannot develop without expanding its mining and oil industries. This extractivist development model, though, it's also perpetuated not just by this ideology or this idea, but real pressures and constraints. Given that these sectors now account, as I said earlier, for a majority of foreign exchange earnings, in a context of trade liberalization. The state, as I said before, has also become dependent on these rents for about 30% of the income, and it also could face very costly lawsuits backed by international investment and trade treaties if it backs down from its promises to these industries. In fact, oil and mining companies have already instigated quite a few multi-million-dollar legal proceedings against the Colombian government using these free trade agreement as a basis for the lawsuits. This, the absolute prioritization of these sectors in terms of land use, it's evident, right, in the law. They're absolutely prioritized. They don't even allow, the law doesn't even allow for the possibility that other land uses might be more economically, socially, or ecologically valuable. That the situation, for example, can be varied in different places at different moments in times. As I said, the oil and mining sectors have been given this dispossession free pass. And I don't think it's because they're particularly special to public utility and social interest, in my view, not any more so than any other, like agriculture, for example. And in fact, you could say less so, and they have many more problems associated, not least coal and oil in terms of climate change. But anyway, the point is, why these industries? And my feeling is it's because they are really dependent on state coercion, because they require land in very specific locations, right? You can't dig for gold anywhere, right? There's not coal everywhere. And in case of open pit mines, also you need large areas, right? Large, huge surface areas for an open pit coal mine or an open pit gold mine. In the case of oil, the area themselves is not so large, but you need contiguous access to land. So you need plots like for oil pipelines or for roads or for water wastewater pipelines or water extraction pipelines. So as I said before, these sectors actually rely on the state's eminent domain powers. Oh my goodness. A third point is how the state's taking powers act as a guarantee, which enable companies to force land sales and easement contracts at below market prices without direct intervention by the government. So as I said, the official discourse says these private transfers are voluntary, but actually in a lot of cases they're not, so that the sort of ubiquity of coercion, if you will, is disguised. A fourth point is about how these coerced transfers and use agreements backed by eminent domain powers often entail a regressive redistribution of wealth, right? So I talked about undercompensation being a class phenomenon. The fifth point is that state-backed dispossession obviously exists independently of the armed conflict in Colombia in the abstract, but not in practice. That does not mean, however, that peace, for example, is going to be the answer to land grabbing as it's often sort of portrayed. I'm oversimplifying, right? But the case, for example, of the FARC EP, the disarmament of the FARC could actually enable new processes of dispossession because it's opening up areas where investments had been limited precisely because of these rebels' presence. One can hope that a de-escalation of the armed conflict would imply less violence in struggles over land, but I suspect it may also mean more direct involvement of the state's coercive apparatus, right? They had kind of, I don't know if you want to say outsourced maybe isn't the right word, but And resistance to dispossession, it's not likely to disappear. It may even grow. And my final point, and that's why I put these quotes here on the slide. My final point is just, about how often you hear in Colombia social leaders saying they're willing to die to defend their territory, their community, their land, right? And in Colombia, this is more than just words. People do actually die every day for fighting with an oil company or a mining company, or trying to prevent a dam from being built or whatever it is. But the reason I put it here is because I think it's a really clear expression of value incommensurability. And most institutions work on this assumption: land's just a commodity, you can replace it, you can compensate with money. But the fact that people would sort of risk being killed before giving up their lands shakes this assumption to its foundations. And this problem of value incommensurability, I believe, is the problem at the heart of debates on public or social interest and disagreements about under what conditions it's acceptable to force someone from their land or from their home. And next slide, please. Oh dear. Yeah. Next slide, please. So I'm moving on I'm going to try and fly through this, but I'm moving on to the paper that was circulated to go with my presentation, which, as I said before, was actually a spin-off from my PhD research. And I think it's important to stress the context and rationale for this paper. Basically, in a lot of the literature on land grabbing, but even, especially the mainstream literature, but even some critical studies, treat land grabbing as a developing country problem, right? They have weak and corrupt legal systems, they don't have proper property institutions. That's why there's all this land grabbing happening in these countries. And I found there's quite rich literature actually on coercive land acquisitions in the US, but that dispossession scholars working on dispossession, people working on dispossession in the global South, sorry, myself included, are just not engaging with this literature. So one of my main objectives with this article was to use cases from the United States to shed a different light on land grabbing in the global South. Next slide, please. This paper about the United States, it was serendipity. It was not part of my plan. It wasn't like part of my research plan. I was there, it was early 2016. I should have been writing my PhD thesis. Instead, I was watching the US primary Republican debates. Seems like a very long time ago, before Trump was even president. But the issue of eminent domain kept coming up again and again in these debates. And I was sort of fascinated by it. And I actually was going to show you this video of Trump talking in one of these debates, but we don't have time, so I took out the video. But the basic gist of it is that Trump was defending expropriation, right? And he was saying things like, he agrees 100% with the Kelo decision, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And I was amazed because, this guy's supposed to be a Republican. He is a businessman, right? And he's just openly defending an expansion of the state's power to expropriate. And you have to remember that US Republicans are supposed to be zealous defenders of private property and limited government. That's kind of, that's what Republicans are, right? And this is the United States, no less, where any hint of state interference is usually labeled communist or socialist, right? People from the US think the NHS, the British NHS is communist, So the context, I was kind of shocked by this, basically. Next slide, please. And I started digging around, and I was just fascinated by it. So this report, written by Dana Berliner, but it's published by the US Institute for Justice. They found over 10,000 cases of actual or threatened expropriation. And threats in the case of the US, it's a bit different because you actually get a letter. If you do not sell, we will apply eminent domain proceedings. So threats can be more easily documented in the US than in Colombia because you actually get a letter through the post. But anyway, they found over 10,000 cases of actual or threatened expropriation favoring private parties in just 4 years, between 1998 and 2002. And the other thing that's really interesting about and it's documented in this report, the other interesting thing about expropriations in the US, it isn't just used for things like power stations or roads or bridges, right? The typical things. Expropriation is being used in the US for lots of different things like hotels, casinos, shopping centers, parking lots, auto dealerships, golf courses, luxury apartment buildings, you name it. They're using expropriation for this kinds of investment. So I really recommend, if you want more details, this report. You know, it's not an academic publication, but it's really useful, and it goes state by state and tells you about each of the state laws, the 50 states. Next slide, please. So it's really important to emphasize that it's just like in Colombia, this threat of dispossession, it doesn't affect people equally in the US, right? And there's a study by Carpenter and Ross, and they did a statistical analysis of expropriation, and it showed that the targeted areas are disproportionately populated by ethnic minorities and people with low incomes. And yes, I really think it's important to say this. That's why Trump doesn't see a problem with defending the expansion of the state's expropriation powers. Trump is making a good assumption in this case that the state's not likely to expropriate his property, right? I also, there's this photo on the right, I highly recommend if you're interested. There's this artist, Matt Rayner, and he did a photo exhibition of eminent domain in Kansas City. And yeah, if you like that kind of thing, I highly recommend it. Next slide, please. So how could they get away with this legally? Well, maybe this was just me being naive. I thought, you know, when I started looking into this, I think I was quite naive. The taking clause, right, of the US Constitution, like the constitutions or laws of other liberal democracies, is supposed to restrict the government's expropriation powers. It's supposed to make the government's taking powers conditional and exceptional. But the main way it does this is that it's supposed to limit it to public use in the case of the US Constitution. And so everything hinges on how you define concepts like public use or public purpose. Now, in the US, each of the 50 states have their own eminent domain laws and regulations. And some states favor the use of eminent domain more than other states. But what I focused on for my article was the federal Supreme Court ruling, right, from 2005, which is the Kelo versus New London ruling. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to tell you the Kelo story now. We're running out of time, and if you're interested, it's in the paper, and also there's other journalists and academics who've written what happened with Kelo and Suzette Kelo and her neighbors. Yeah, it's easy enough to find the story. All you need to know is that the city of New London wanted to rebuild an entire area of the town and was willing to expropriate people's homes in order to do so. And what happened to Suzette Kelo and her neighbors, it wasn't particularly new or particularly unusual, but they managed to get, what was different was that they managed to get their case taken all the way to the federal Supreme Court, which basically agreed to review a previous judgment and to decide whether taking property for the purpose of economic development satisfies the public use requirement of the Fifth Amendment. And their answer was yes. It was a close call, 5 in favor and 4 against or dissenting, but they ruled that expropriation of private property for economic development can be considered a constitutional application of eminent domain. And I just want to say, you know, that it's not that everything changed. They kind of just endorsed previous legal decisions and endorsed an already well-established practice of expropriating farmers, owners, homeowners, and small businesses to make way for private investments that are supposedly going to generate development. But in any case, this ruling is considered a milestone, and it's what I used to sort of what I focused on in my paper. Next slide, please. Now, the implications of this text are enormous, because they basically suggest, or the implications of the arguments in this legal text is that authorities don't actually have to provide any evidence that an expropriation is necessary that it has a defined objective, or that actual public benefits are likely to be achieved, right? The other thing is that authorities can take the property of one private party and transfer it to another private party, just so long as this is not the sole objective, or so long as this also serves a so-called public purpose. And public purpose in this case includes things, very generic things like generating taxes and jobs. And so if we follow this logic, almost every single private for-profit venture is redefined as a project of public purpose, and basically the government can expropriate whenever it likes, whoever it wants, for whatever it wants, just as long as it says, yeah, we're doing this for the public, right? There's no legal sort of constraint, legal sort of barrier there. Next slide, please. Sorry,
do you think you should wrap up in about 5 minutes?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm running through this very quickly because, but I hope some of you maybe read the text anyway, so hopefully not all of this is new. And so the implications are enormous, and I really found Judge O'Connor, who was a dissenting judge, she disagreed with the argument of her peers. I really found her dissenting opinion really interesting. And she said, you know, under the banner of economic development, all private property is now vulnerable to being taken and transferred to another private owner. Next slide, please. And we don't have time to read these, but the argument here is that there's a clear bias against certain groups, right? So there's clear implications for inequality. Is clearly going to favor certain groups and disfavor other groups, and the dissenting judges, both of them recognize that. It's really interesting in the US, for example, that in some states like California, you're only allowed to expropriate so-called blighted properties. But who lives in these so-called blighted properties? Well, low income or poor people, of course. So it's quite clearly, again, a class phenomenon. And it's interesting that both dissenting judges commented on this. Final slide. Next slide, please. It's the last one. So with this last slide, I just wanted to get you thinking about this as a global issue, right? I was talking today about Colombia and the US, but from reading other texts, I found, you know, this seems it could be a global trend. That doesn't mean there aren't exceptions, but there seems to be many other cases. And I want to end with some leading questions. Yeah, they're leading questions, but I'd like to sort of, yeah, leave that open. What does all this tell us about the nature of liberal democratic states and their role in capitalist market economies? What does this tell us about landed property rights and their place in capitalist market economies? I think, you know, I think what's happening in Colombia, in the US, and in other places in the world destabilizes some very basic assumptions that a neoclassical market economists hold very dear. So yeah, I'm sorry for going a few minutes over time. Well, 10 minutes over time. I apologize for that, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, we know it's not easy to keep the time in the intended given time. So thank you for your presentation. It was very rich, and I'm just now going to give the floor to Mehrdad Vahabi to introduce the discussion for 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomson, for your very rich communication. I think it was very rich because it had included two parts, two papers instead of one. I prepared, in fact, my report on the North American case, but you added a second case, the Colombian case. Now we have the whole continent, southern and northern. That gives us the possibility to do a comparative analysis of the two cases. I would say that what is very strong in your paper about North America is that, contrary to what you know, the economics of law suggests, even in the cases where the property rights are clearly defined and the allocation of those rights can be done through legal terms, even in those cases, we cannot say that the expropriation by the state is shunned, is eschewed. And in case when you develop the Colombian case, it is very easy for the economists who are accustomed to the literature in terms of economics of law to say that we accept the whole story because in that case, in the Colombian case, the terms of property are not clearly defined. The property rights are not protected. And then we have these borderlines that should be clarified by the law. I really enjoyed your published paper because, in fact, you highlight at least 3 major points. The first one is a very subtle criticism of an implicit assumption in the economic literature that the state is a benevolent dictator maximizing the interest of public and not pursuing the private interest of interest groups. Now, you show exactly the reverse story, the opposite case. The second point, which is very strongly demonstrated in your analysis, is the definition and the relationship which you establish between expropriation and the state intervention. Your definition of expropriation is not limited, is not narrowed down to the private sector, but it broadens, extends it to the state. And I clearly subscribe to your definition of expropriation, in which the state has a prominent case. And last but not least is what I just said. You really show that expropriation in the US is neither rigorously conditional nor particularly exceptional. Having said all these qualities of your paper, I would like to highlight some points that seem to me to be controversial or needs a further analysis and exploring more about the details. I start first by your very interesting idea regarding the use of different terms for expropriation, for land grabbing under the name of eminent domain. You clearly distinguish what exists in French law, in American law, and in European legislation regarding the use of, say, for example, under the title of public use, public interest, or public benefits. The terms are completely different. And you show that each term has some particular implication. But what I really like to know more is that whether there is an evolution of the term. If we take, for example, the case of North American case, we see that at the start for this eminent domain, it was clearly in the 5th Amendment, it was expressed public use and not public interest. But historically speaking, it can be documented, evidence that we have broadened, extended the scope of state intervention. And with extending the scope of state intervention, the term changed. There was a shift from public use to public interest. This point has clearly been documented by many economists, including Epstein, 1985, Paul, 1988, Jones, 2000, Ely, 2003, Benson, 2008, and Vahabi, 2016. Then I would say that it would be better to grasp your point if instead of comparing different parts of the world, for example, France, European Union, and America, you could have been focused on the American case and show how the term shifted from public use to public interest. A second point that I would like to raise is about the meaning of property rights. What do we mean by property rights? Is it property right over the object or the right of action? Say, this point is really discussed within the literature named property rights literature, Demsetz, Alkion, and the others. They showed and they discussed it thoroughly that property is not over thing. Property is over the right of action. I take an example. I have a car. This car is an object to travel to this place. But if the speed limit is 60 kilometers, as it was the case in Cuba, the value of this car is completely different from the same car, say in West Germany, in which we could, have a speed even about 200 kilometers. The value of the car changes with the right of action which we allow in using that property. If it is the case, then we do not really use coercion or brutal force to expropriate. Take, for example, a land in the middle of the city, and by zoning, the right of action over that land alter radically. We can, make a land to a price equal 0, or to change a land's price from 0 to $2,000 per square meters. Okay, the change relates not to the object, but to the right of action that we create. That is why zoning is extremely important in determining the value of land. In that case, we do not need to focus to underline the importance of coercion. It suffices to say, how is the extent of the state intervention? In this way, I am saying that whenever we are extending the state intervention, there may be no need to further coercion, but just changing the right of action. The third point, you raise this point, but you do not explore it further. You argue that the point of accumulation of capital, it might be more profitable to expropriate land. Implicitly, you are suggesting that perhaps it is better to nationalize the land. As you can imagine, this proposal exists among some economists. One of the first one is Karl Marx, who suggested the nationalization of land. The second one, it may be a little bit surprising for you, is Leon Walras, someone who is known as liberal. He was also a socialist, synthetic socialism. Hayek criticized him very much, and he was suggesting to nationalize land. And why is it so? To propose it, we cannot just limit ourselves to an empirical approach. We need a theory about rent. And we know that in Marx, we have two kinds of rents, absolute rent and differential rent. According to Marx, we can nationalize the land just to abolish the absolute rent. And this was also the idea of Leon Walras, even though Walras had another approach to the land rent. I think what is missing a little bit in your analysis is a theory of rent, land rent. We do not have some, hints or clues how you analyze the issue of land rent. I have a fourth question that is related to the third one, and it is the type of, rent on rural land and urban lands. Because for the urban lands, differential rents becomes more important than absolute rents. Whereas in agricultural land, absolute rents become more, impending. I would like to finish by saying also, or asking a kind of question, is I didn't really figure out what is your position about land reform, because land reform in some respects may be analyzed as a form of land grabbing, But some other, theorists and some other social scientists like Pablo Luna says that land reform is not as the same category of land grabbing. And he suggests that land reform is rather a kind of negative land grabbing. It is the inverse, it's the opposite. We know among the economists, we have an economist, I personally like him very much. His name is familiar to you, I am sure, Hirschman. Hirschman is one who worked a lot about economic reforms in Latin American countries, and he insisted on the importance of land reform as a means for economic development and capitalist expansion. Okay, now the question is that we have enclosure in during 16th to 18th century in England about the common law and communal land. As you say, it is different than expropriation, but we have also land reform, which was a way of, preparing the way, paving the way for capitalism, or the grand transformation, as Karl Polanyi said. Okay, now what is the relationship between land grabbing and, economic reform about land? Last, I promise you this time, this is the last one. I wonder why you didn't engage in a more, I don't say more even, why you don't raise the question of Coase theorem, Ronald Coase theorem. And, because what you are talking about is, Posner, Eric Posner's and the economic of law. Okay, then whatever you said about the American law is closely, intimately related to Coase theorem. And if you want to criticize and to engage in a real discussion, you should go further to attack the citadel. And the citadel is Coase, Ronald Coase. And I was really, in the middle of my reading, I said, why Dr. Thomson is so silent about this story? Now, I think your paper may engage more with economic literature and be read more by economists. We need multidisciplinary, attitude. This seminar is really there to strengthen, to promote multidisciplinary discussions. Political scientists, anthropologists, economists, and philosophers to have a kind of discussion. But we have read each other and refer to each other so that this discussion could be possible. Thank you very much for taking so much energy and effort to show two different papers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehrdad Vahabi, for your discussion, introducing this discussion, and thank you for your enthusiasm. And I think maybe Francis want to answer, maybe try to do it short if it's possible, so that we can go on and have some more people also intervening and asking questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Vahabi. That was it was a great discussion. You covered a lot of ground in a few minutes. I'm going to try to just, I don't know if I'll cover all of the things, but I just sort of say, starting maybe back to front with the end. I really agree with what you say, and I think I have to work a lot harder to engage with the economics literature. I did in my thesis, there wasn't, you can't do everything in one article. I did in my thesis engage with law and economics scholars who work on eminent domain. And I have to say, it was quite a lot of hard work for me because I wasn't used to the language they use and the concepts they use. And what I understood from this literature, the ones that I read, is that basically what they try to do, for me it seems like madness. They try to take free market theory and make it reconcile expropriation with free market theory. So they try to sort of say, well, look, the only reason people don't want to sell, like they just assume, the only reason people don't want to sell, right, is because they know that they can hold out, they're holdouts, and so they can get tons of money. And so in a normal situation, they would have accepted this amount of money. So we're just going to pretend that these transactions were voluntary. And it's a bit like I had like a look at some of your work, and it's a bit like what what you mentioned in your work about sort of treating involuntary transactions as if they are voluntary. And for me, anyway, it's madness. So I do address this a little bit in my thesis, and basically talk about how law and economics scholars have tried to kind of get over this, I call it a cognitive dissonance, right? Because it's just like these real facts are just so uncomfortable for neoclassical free market theory. And in my opinion, they don't manage conceptually or theoretically to, that's, you know, that was my conclusion, to try to reconcile free market theory with expropriation. But yes, I really take that point well, and I do want to try to engage more with economic literature. And I also, you know, advice would be welcome also about how to do it, like what platforms to go to, you know, what's the right way to engage, because I think it's quite difficult when you're not an economist by training to know, yeah, where to go and how to do it. So about the issue of land reform. So one of the things that I also talk about in my thesis is, so I make it clear from the beginning, look, my thesis is about elite land grabbing. I know it's a bit of a lazy word, elite, but it's kind of to cover lots of different upper classes, right? And I don't address dispossession of the elites much. I do talk about land reform though in my thesis, and I think, you know, one of the arguments I try to make is that dispossession, we can't solve it with things like titling, with like, oh right, some laws, right? Dispossession is always changing, and in some cases, actually, you know, the working class, the masses, the ideology can be in their favor, so that dispossession is favoring them rather than the other way around, right? And I still think it's dispossession, but the question or the key issue is what is happening in terms of distribution, right? So the land grabbing I'm interested in, that I study, and which is most common, you know, especially nowadays, is, or dispossession that I'm interested in, is regressive redistribution of wealth. You're taking land from poor people, from campesinos, right, from indigenous groups, from poor working class families in the US, whatever. You're taking from lower, right? But yeah, I would say that the other way around is dispossession. The question, you know, is about, well, in this case, what does the dispossession do? It's redistributing land from an elite to a larger group. And in some cases, you know, that's going to have a positive impact. Like in South Korea, they did it very well. They did land reform very well. And in other cases, you know, it's not going to work so well. So it's not like I'm for or against land reform, because there's examples of it working really well, and there's examples of it failing, you know. And I think Colombia really needs a land reform, but it's always failed, and part of the reason is the elite resistance has been so strong all these years. So yeah, that's kind of about land reform. I do think it's a form of dispossession, but it's not the type of dispossession I'm interested in. And you know, and I do think that's interesting, just to sort of one more point on that, is that when we talk about expropriation, like in the news, for example, it tends to be like, oh, you know, look at Castro, look at Chavez, you know, they're these socialists that are expropriating, right? And there's rarely a look at, you know, it's like socialists and communists expropriate, right? And it often goes really wrong. I'm not saying, no, this is a really good idea. It often goes really wrong. But the point is, supposedly, the socialists and communists supposedly are expropriating for, actually, in this case, really for the public good. Supposedly, they're nationalizing oil so that they can, you know, share the benefits, or what, you know, or they're doing a land reform. So it's not only the elite. So it's kind of ironic. And on the point of nationalization, so I'm not proposing, you know, I don't have a conclusion completely, like what's the perfect land policy or land law. You know, I can't tell you this is exactly what land laws and land policy should look like. But I'm not proposing nationalization. I think what I was trying to say in that bit of the paper was more about how ironic it is that nationalized land can actually end up serving this system of land grabbing, right? Because it's not titled, then the state doesn't need to go through this whole difficult process of expropriating private property. And so it's kind of ironic that in places like Ethiopia, right, where they nationalized land, supposedly a socialist government. I don't know what its socialist credentials really are, but it's so interesting that Ethiopia nationalized its land, and it's just using this to just kind of hand over huge areas of land to Chinese companies, to Indian companies. So I was just trying to make that point that actually, you know, it's quite convenient to have a large area of state-owned land that you can just give away as a government to your favorite company. And yeah, I also will look into theories of rents. Yeah, I think it's something, you're right. I don't touch on that even in my thesis, and I think it's something I need to think about a lot more. And then the I don't know if I'm covering them all. Yeah, I think you're right. I think we need to look at the history and how it's changed and why it's changed. And luckily for the US, as you said, other people have done it, so I don't have to do it. Someone else, lots of people have touched on this. You yourself, the people I cite, I think are, what are they called, Werner and, anyway, I've cited a few people who do this history, and so it's already done. And in the case of Colombia, you know, that's kind of what I try to do. I try to look at not the change of the word, but look at how dispossession has changed over time, and why it's changed, and what are the circumstances, you know, for dispossession policy or related policies to change. But yeah, I agree with you. Historical perspective is really, really valuable. And finally, and I hope I haven't missed anything. Yeah, I think like your point about property rights maybe had two different elements to it. I agree. I found it really difficult in my thesis to find like a definition of property rights that worked both in a theoretical sense, but also in a practical sense, like, because I have to use this word. So every time I use it, does it mean what I said it meant, you know? Anyway, so I agree that property rights, right, are relational. They're essentially a relational thing, right? But at the same time, you know, often when we're talking about property rights, we're talking about actually like the legal sort of, the legally bestowed kind of, you know, this person owns this for these reasons, right? And obviously then there's the question of, okay, how would you put it? Do people who don't have titles have property rights? And I think they do, but that's not how most people think about it. So it's, in some cases, not helpful to think that way. Yeah, but it's a sticky issue. I agree with you. And the other thing is about market. I think it was a thing about market prices versus values, right? And it's definitely clear that the market price, or the sort of market value, if you will, rather than the use value of the land will change, as you said, like with the zoning law, or in the case of if this area is being sort of, what's the word, zoned for mining as well, you know, for other things. But I think, you know, in the case, the point I try to make in the presentation as well is that a lot of times this kind of sort of inflation of the value isn't going to do much for the people who are actually getting dispossessed, right? So it might be relevant if you're very powerful and you know, they want my farm for this gold mine, you know, and then you're sort of a powerful person, you say, oh, you can have my farm, but it's going to cost you, you know, 3 times or whatever. So I try to make that point in the presentation, but I do agree that these kinds of, you know, the value or the price is really varied, and something like a zoning law can change that, or a plan for a big discovery that there's oil or gold in the area. So yeah, I hope I covered most of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think the point was to answer, to have the discussion roll on, and not to obviously in 10 minutes cover a discussion and maybe a research program that can develop further in the future. So thank you so much. And I would like to invite anybody who is willing to ask any question. I know that Michelle, who has joined us, thank you for joining us, Michelle, who is working with the Acteur Association. Well, I will let you maybe present Acteur in like one word, because I know Frances was also interested in engaging with this network. And after, if anyone else wants to like put their name on the chat, and if not, I would like also to share some thoughts with you in 2 minutes. So Michelle, maybe you can go on. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Frances, for your conference. It was very, very interesting. It would be easier for me to speak Spanish, but I will try to speak English. But I would like to draw your attention to the link that has existed from the outset between exclusive property and dispossession. And I think that we have some papers in our website that could be interesting for you, no? So the question of the words is very, it's a problem. There is a very important word trap, no? So what we call propiedad in Spanish, propriété in Frances is completely different from the term property in English, no? And really, what the absolute land, absolute, exclusive and absolute property over land, land ownership, has been invented by the bourgeoisie after the French Revolution. And really, it has been established in order to dispossess the weakest. So from the beginning, there is a very strong relationship between absolute property and dispossession. And this does not mean that all types of property rights, individual or collectives, should be condemned. Quite the contrary, no? But I will send you in the chat a reference in French of Joseph Combi of the link between the property rights declaration and the question of property, no? And in a very few words, in English, the sentence of the property as an inviolable and sacred right did not appear in the first publication of the right of the rights declaration. And what was really, it was introduced later, and really it was introduced to make possible the question of expropriation, no? So it was possible to expropriate people if you gave them some compensation, no? So really, it's exactly the opposite. And the article is very interesting. I will be short, no? But I think it would be interesting for you to have a look at it. Unfortunately, it has not been translated in English, but we will try to do it. And we have also another thing which seems important is the question of public interest or when you explain, no? So when economically, we had a few decades ago, we had two ways to make appraisals of projects or politics or policies, no? We had one from evaluating the input for the investor or the entrepreneur, no? And the other one was to try to have an evaluation of the interest for all the people. And this was the cost and benefit analysis. It was also did by the World Bank, no? Not only by leftist people. No? And this has been completely abandoned now. So this is another issue which I think should be interesting to link with your analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. And I don't know if, well, for now, nobody else seems to be willing to ask a question. I will take the opportunity to share a few thoughts. And thank you again for your presentation, and thank you, Mehrdad, for your discussion. Yeah, I wanted to just share that maybe by re-engaging with this historical perspective that we mentioned could well help us reset the question of state at the center of this study of dispossession and grabbing. And I think there are literature, well, actually, Frances, during your presentation, you mentioned, but maybe not specifically in these terms, but you mentioned kind of a symbiotic relation between the sector of oil and gas and minerals and the state. And you said, yeah, these sector, they need dispossession, they need state-backed dispossession. And so I think this invites us to think in terms of how the evolution of property rights and dispossession and public utility is to be understood in terms of how the legislative, the judiciary, and the bureaucratic and the military dimension of state have evolved. And I think it's quite interesting to see that both in Colombia and in the US, this evolution is still, I mean, this process of changing of meaning is still going on. Because I think the Supreme Court in the US, it was in 2005, in Colombia 2018, and actually this evolution of property from a physical thing to a right to do something or unphysical assets was studied by Commons, and this is how his reflection, Commons' reflection was titled "The Legal Foundation of Capitalism," and I thank Mehrdad for inviting me to read in details this specific chapter actually, and I think you could be interested in doing that. So I think the evolution of public interest, property right, and the states are things that maybe need to be tackled together and in relation with each other. And I think there are other literature because we talked about the Americas, but I think it's also interesting to turn to Africa maybe in that sense. And there is a political scientist called Zina Schlimmer. She recently published a thesis on Tanzania and how actually dealing with land allows the state and the bureaucratic apparatus of state to build itself actually. So I can send you the reference if you're interested. But yeah, just wanted to share this reference with you. And last thought I wanted to share was the question of informal institution. That is, do people who have like access to land but who have no title, no formal title, have rights, property rights? Actually, there is this whole literature and debate in developing studies, but also in economics actually, about informal institution, and author who is actually very interesting, I think, is Jennifer Mutaz-Ashvili, and she studied Afghanistan and argued that actually informal institutions may be as efficient as the state to deal with the property and land. So yeah, these were only a few comments that listening to your talk came to my mind. Anybody else wants to take the floor, or maybe Frances, you want to answer, or someone else?
I'm happy to say a few things while people think. Michelle, I'm very sad that I can't read in French. I'm going to have to learn. But yes, please, I would love it if you could share, especially if there's something in Spanish. I would love if you could share some of these documents with me. I would find it really interesting to look at them. So yeah, or point me in the right direction. I think Emma sent me the link to your website, so I'm going to have another dig around. And I definitely agree with you about, this. the way I put it in my thesis is it's like a contradiction at the heart of the capitalist land regime, right? So that's kind of how I thought it through. And I don't know if you'd agree with putting it this way, but so we have this, the creation of absolute property rights or exclusive property rights, or the development of what we call modern property rights, which, as you said, it's really recent, right? And you know, Marx talks about this in his famous chapters about primitive accumulation, although I actually think Marx does it much better, this specific point, in his, he has this series of articles about the debates on the theft of wood, and he talks about how property used to sort of have a different meaning and how the definition of property was changing to sort of exclude these customary use rights that was in Prussia. But yeah, so I absolutely agree. And you know, I know the what happened in France less well, but in the case of England and Scotland, for example, you know, you can really see this happening. And what I find is interesting is that you know, basically here's how I put it. Capitalism needs to impose and enforce property rights. It needs that, right? It needs this kind of exclusive property rights being enforced and enclosed. And I'm thinking about land here, exclusively about land. But it also needs to violate those same rights. It also needs to undermine those same rights. And like, it's very abstract. But in practice, we can see, you know, that the sort of development of capitalism required this, you know, these absolute property rights, like what happened with the enclosures, with improvement in England, right? But at the same time, it's got this system where now you've given people the right to say, actually, no thanks, I don't want to sell you land, or no thanks, I don't want to, you know, be super productive and profitable. You know, it doesn't always work like that. Like John Locke's landlords were super improving, and you know, but if you look at what the landlords looked like in Colombia in the 1600s and 1700s, they were really kind of, you know, they weren't, John Locke wouldn't have liked them. He wouldn't have liked them as they're like super improving, you know, bourgeois sort of landowners, right? So yeah, so I agree that it's you know, we need this historical perspective and we need to look at both, and I think it's a kind of interesting contradiction. And yeah, I think that links to what what you were saying about how, you know, we need this historical view and to put the state at the center to understand the evolution of property. And I would be interested in maybe, you know, later if you could send me an email with some of the articles you mentioned, the books you mentioned, to read them. Yeah, I think in terms of informal institutions, like I definitely think the you know, the evidence is clear that these informal institutions often work very well. The problem for the government is that it doesn't, the state, that's the point, the state doesn't have control over them, at least in the context I know, right? So if these informal institutions are operating, you know, the state's not very happy about it. It needs to centralize control. And actually one of the many reasons that I critique this, I mean, one of the many ways you can critique this idea of you know, there's land dispossession because these people don't have property rights. It's very simplistic, kind of ahistorical view, is looking at it, you know, the other way around, which is like at some moment in time, someone decided that possession and use is not a proof of ownership, right? Which is completely counterintuitive. Right, as a human, it's counterintuitive. And the person I think that explains this best, which is, I just adore it, is the book The Grapes of Wrath. I don't know if any of you have read it, but if you study land, maybe think about rereading Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath with the lens of property rights and land grabbing on. And it's just an amazing book. And he just shows how sort of counterintuitive and it's not logical, right? That someone who's, I don't know, I've been farming the land for 20 years. This is my house. I've been here, you know, or my grandfather owned it and his grandfather owned it, but you don't have a piece of paper that says you're the owner, so you don't have, you know, official property rights. It's not yours. So yeah, it's informal institutions can work up to a point, but at least in places like Colombia, you know, they can work well at quite a local level, but then once you've got mining and multinational mining and oil companies coming in, they don't care about, you know, informal arrangements. They just want to see, you know, oh great, you haven't got a property title, we don't have to compensate you, you know. That's all they're kind of concerned with. And in that sense, like, I think pragmatism, you know, being pragmatic, at least in the context of Colombia, means that these people need to, you know, they have to fight for titles, even if they know it's not going to protect them against dispossession. It's like it's a tool, you know, that they're going to use. Yeah, I sort of went off rambling on a tangent. I don't know if anyone has other questions or something that I missed in those many or topics, you know.
Yeah, I think there were so many very relevant ways to engage in that. Maybe we need some more time to reboot and reprocess everything. And yeah, I just wanted to add one more reference, and maybe, I don't know if someone else, I don't want to monopolize the place, but yeah, regarding the informal rights, and that you said, yeah, when big companies when there's an asymmetry of power, an actor comes in, and then the informal rights seems to be, trampled. Actually, there are some laws, and maybe Michel can complete if I'm not, add stuff if I'm not totally clear, but in Mali, actually, there was a law which was passed in 2017, I believe, that basically enabled village communities to negotiate and put forward basically a cadastre and decide for themselves the zoning. So which part of the village land could be used for farming, which other part should be used only for living, which parts could be used for farming for exports, and which part could be used for consumption for food. And then the state would maybe, let's say, put the decision into official formal title. So I think that's something that's going on, and that there are pros and cons, but it's also an interesting entry to question the place of state in property rights.
That's, I mean, the formalization, or I mean, there's different, each country's different, right? So sometimes they sort of designate power to certain local authorities or traditional authorities. Yeah, I mean, I think in that sense, like my view is a bit narrow. I have tried to read about, you know, like Ethiopia and Mozambique and other countries, but like it's not a context that I know deeply the way I know, for example, Colombia. So like in Colombia, what they did is quite interesting. And actually, the strange thing about Colombia is it has in some ways, its laws can be quite progressive, especially when you compare them to other countries. So Colombia has signed ILO Convention 169, for example, in terms of indigenous rights, and its indigenous and Afro communities can have collective property titles, which I mentioned, I think, in the presentation. But yeah, it's the devil's in the detail always, as they say, right? I mean, so they have these collective titles which are inalienable, which is amazing that the Colombian government allowed that, because of course the World Bank was like, inalienable titles, you know, Hernando Soto is like turning over 5 times, like, you can't have inalienable titles, they're worthless. Why would you have an inalienable land title? So, but anyway, they do have these, you know, quite interesting, you know, I guess you might call them property institutions in Colombia, and in some ways, the law is quite progressive, but you know what happens in practice, as I said, is like, okay, so we can't expropriate, they can't sell the land, so we're just going to go in and, you know, mine for gold anyway, and then it's like, yes, we are signatories to ILO Convention 169, and we have promised Indigenous people that they're going to be consulted, but we never said you could veto a project. We never said you get to say no. You don't actually get to say no. So this created this really kind of catch-22 situation for Indigenous groups, right, or Afro groups as well, where the only way they have to influence or say anything or kind of sort of stand up for, you know, say, well, you know, to negotiate, I suppose, only channel or influence they might have is through this process of prior consultation. But they also know that at the end of the day, the company and the government will listen to them and say, okay, yeah, not this bit, you know, this area is especially important to you, or, but at the end of the day, they'll say, okay, well, we're doing the, you know, we're doing the gold mine, or we're installing the oil well. And so it's the cat and mouse game is really interesting, because then these, you know, some of the people I spoke to, the Indigenous authorities or leaders, you know, very cleverly said, okay, well, what we do is we just stall until they're really bored, so that it never comes to the conclusion, because as soon as the consultation process ends, then, you know, that's like their sort of official stamp. We complied with the law, we did a consultation, now we're coming in to dig the mine. So they would stall and try and kind of prolong it so that it never got to the end. And that was kind of like a resistance strategy, right? And it's quite an interesting one. But then the government came out with this presidential, I don't think it was a decree, actually, it was a resolution. I can't remember the technical type of document it was, but it was a, you know, a legal document regulating how prior consultation should be carried forward. And it basically says, well, the thing is, you know, if the Indigenous authorities or representatives and communities don't show up a certain number of times, then we'll just take it as the project's been accepted. So, you know, it's a cat and mouse game where they're trying, the sort of Indigenous authorities trying to find ways to get around this, but then the government finds ways to sort of knock down that form of resistance. And yeah, it's a really catch-22 situation, because, you know, they've fought years to be consulted, and then when they are consulted, it doesn't matter what they think. So yeah, I think that kind of instance is really, yeah, I was quite shocked by that, honestly, because I just thought consultation's always good. And anyway, I'm rambling. I can't, you know, I don't know if there's any other questions or other issues that we, you know, that you want to talk about.
I think Michelle wanted to add something quickly, or maybe someone else.
I want to add some comment, very quick. And first, and ask you, Francis, to send us, or Emma to send us your email to go on exchanging on those issues, because it's very, there are much more things to say. No, I think that there were two things that were very important. One was commented by Mehrdad Vahabi, the question of ground rent, the importance of ground rent nowadays, no, to understand what is happening. And I think this is a key issue. And another one which is very important is that the question is not only of capitalism. So when you see what happened in the socialist countries, it happened exactly the same. No? As a question of ground rent is also a question in the socialist countries. And the second point, or the third point, is a question of legal pluralism, of recognizing that the law is not only made by the state, and the law is not only the law of the most potent, the most powerful people, no? But there is also a law from the people in the country, no? And the different communities. No? And this is the story of Mali, of Niger, with the construction of land governance at local level. So a lot of important things to share, but I will send you some more documents in Spanish and some quick translations to English also. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I would really, really appreciate if you could share some of those texts with me. That would be really interesting to read them. And yeah, Spanish is fine. I can also try to look at things in French, but I probably will only understand a very small part of it. I'm just...
Yeah, Jonathan, sure, go on. Thank you.
Okay, I will try. I don't know if you can hear me because my mic, I think I have problems with my, yes? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Thomson. Well, I have more question related to Colombia specifically, because I am Peruvian, so I know a little bit about the conflict. But I think that, well, in Colombia, which during the conflict, what we had was really a group of landowners, but also medium farmers who demanded the protection of the state against the guerrilla, for instance. And they also, I think, self-organized in small bands, small. I don't know if you know about AUC, Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia. So that then became criminal as well. So I don't know, in my view, correct me if I am wrong. For the case of Colombia, it was more like these landowners, and perhaps not great landowners, but also medium and small, seek protection in the state against the guerrillas. But if we can name other cases in the same region, for instance, Chile and in Peru, which is I am more familiar, it was the opposite actually. There was the state who appropriates the land, and it was the people who resist the state. Well, I don't know. I don't know if you have some comments about that. Thank you very much. And also something to add about, but this is more an approach. I don't know if you know about Joram Barcel. He writes about a difference between economic property rights and legal property rights that you can use. For instance, I don't know if it can be useful for you. I think also that Mehrdad, he is not he disagrees with this approach, so perhaps also he can he may have a word about it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I've read a few texts about Peru. I don't know a lot about Peru, but the impression I got from reading the texts that I did read is that the Shining Path were a really different type of creature, a really different type of rebel group than the FARC, the EPL, and the ELN. Not that I know much about EPL and ELN, I know a little bit more about the FARC, but the impression I got was that the Shining Path were quite a different rebel group. And if there was a rule book on what not to do as a rebel group, it seems like Shining Path followed that book and did everything wrong as a rebel group. That's the impression I get. You know, as someone who doesn't know Peru very well, it seems like Shining Path just turned, just kind of expropriated, or that's not the right word, I shouldn't use that word, but took land from peasant farmers and kind of gave it to their what would you call that, like their favored supporters and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's the impression I get, that what happened in Peru is quite different. But as I said, I don't know Peru well. So with Colombia, it's quite complicated. I mean, it's always complicated, right? But the history goes back a long way, right? So you have, like, even if you start in the 19th century, right, you have the elites taking over these lands that are Baldío lands, and the law says that these lands should be for the people who work the lands, the peasants, and they just keep kind of accumulating these lands illegally, despite what the law says, right? And so the peasants know that, a lot of these movements, the peasant movements know that these are not their lands legally. They're just kind of using, getting people off the land. So there's this whole cycle of dispossession where the elites are dispossessing the peasants. In this case, really interesting, it's not really about the land itself, it's because there's not enough labor. So it really changes in Colombia. In this case, it's really about controlling labor through land rather than controlling the land itself. But anyway, the point is that I'm trying to get at is, so there's this history of the elite dispossessing the peasants and preventing the peasants from having access to land, even though there's plenty of it. And then there's this, you know, law, the prueba diabólica, they called it, which used to exist. They were going to try to say, look, you have to prove that you actually own this land, and if you don't, then, you know, we're taking it back and we're going to distribute it through an agrarian reform. The agrarian reform law actually ended up, which is kind of hugely ironic, the sort of 1936 one ended up legalizing this historical dispossession and getting rid of this prueba diabólica. So the elites kind of, yeah, it legalized, let's forgive and forget all this land stealing that happened in the past. And I suppose what I'm saying is all this kind of history built up to the conflict in Colombia. So the FARC were a peasant, originally a peasant defense group, and then they became the FARC. They've always demanded land reform as their primary goal. You know, that's another issue, you know, overall. But I would say that the FARC, the other difference is that the FARC were mainly strongest in colonization areas or agrarian frontiers. That's where they were strongest, and so they weren't really, you know, taking lands from elites or anyone in these areas, because they were already sort of, what's the word, peasant settlers were the main group there, right? And the FARC's kind of there with them, and so the FARC didn't do much. They did do a little bit of there are some cases where they, for example, you know, someone left the area and they said, well, this farm is empty, so we're going to give it to this person. So they did do a bit of land redistribution, or distribution, I should say. And there are sort of complaints about this, but this wasn't such a big, yeah, I don't think it was comparable to what the Shining Path did. That's kind of how I would put it. But at the same time, what you're right about, Jonathan, is the landed elites, the rural elites, definitely organized to defend themselves against the guerrilla, right? And the AUC, the paramilitaries, were born of that. That is true, but it was linked to land occupations. But yeah, I would just sort of frame it in terms of there's a sort of dispossession, reclaiming, right, rather than a one process. But yeah, it is true that the paramilitaries kind of emerged as a sort of force that's supposed to represent the landing and owning elite and the threat against them by the guerrillas, but also by the rural agrarian workers who were demanding reform, you know, non-armed actors, basically. So, yeah, I think we're running out of time, hey?
In fact, if there is no question, we are just at our usual time to end the session. And we thank you very much, Francis, for your very excellent, enticing discussion and presentation. And I hope that this will be the start of having some more chats and conversation exchanges on this topic.
Me too. Thank you so much. It's really, so I've learned a lot from talking to you and preparing as well, reading about your work, and it's really been interesting for me. So thank you so much for having me here. And please, Michelle and Emma and Professor Vahabi, I don't know how to say your first name, I'm sorry.
Mehrdad. It's Mehrdad.
Mehrdad. I would love it if you could send me some of the reading.
We will be in contact. That will be for sure. We will be in contact. With great pleasure, Francis.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I also want to thank you, everyone from the organizing team. and Sarah, Jonathan, Victor, Nicola, and yeah, the whole committee took part in this seminar. And yeah, thank you everyone who listened, and thank you again, Frances and Mehrdad, and yeah, have a nice end of the week, and we'll be in touch for further conversation and research.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent weekend for everybody. Have a great day. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.